it's a little odd to do webinar style because I can't see anyone but my own panelists. So I'm just going to talk to my panelists like I'm talking to an audience. This is going to be a quick hour. So I'm going to give us a brief introduction to the event and then in the structure of it, and then we'll just kick right off and we'll get going. So let's hope. Yes, it works. All right. So first of all, we want to thank our sponsors. Utah State University has a Tanner Talk grant and program, which is paying our panelists to be here and for their work and contributing, and we're very indebted. We also want to thank Utah Humanities because they provided this amazing webinar platform and putting it up on YouTube and kind of archiving it for all of us. And then the Utah Poetry Festival for letting this be part of the series of events this month. So we're pretty privileged to have so many humanities organizations supporting us at this time and just deeply grateful, with a special shout out to Case Johnston and Lisa Bickmore. So Lisa's one of our panelists and Utah Poet Laureate, but Case and Lisa together are what kind of made this event come together as like a Utah event that we can all be part of. So very grateful. And then, of course, I want to thank our panelists who also are part of a collection that this entire event is within, and our moderators. So the panelists will get introduced throughout. I'm not going to read every name right now, but I want to give a special shout out to our moderators, Ben Gunsberg, who's also a co-editor with me on the collection that everyone's work is part of, to Basil Payne, who just finished their master's here, just defended an amazing poetry thesis, is off to an MFA program in Maryland, right? And Maya Bethers, who is an alum and does incredible poetry video work that is just beautiful, and graduated from their master's here last year. So thank you for being here and moderating and being willing to jump in at the last minute on some of these things. So the way this is structured today is we're in 4 parts. There's participatory styles, there's visual, there's sound, and there's access. There are 3 panelists per section, and each section will be moderated by one of the people I just mentioned. They'll kind of lead us through a discussion, and if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. Because this is a slightly tighter turnaround for 13 artists, it's possible we won't address all of them. So if you want to email me questions, there'll be a link at the end for reaching out to me, and I'll see what I can do. But I'm going to kick us off on the participatory, and partly because I want to note that participatory is not typically seen as like a mode per se, or even a medium. And that's very intentional. I was telling the panelists right before we hopped on that participatory and access are different ways of thinking about what multimodality can offer, and when they're privileged, what changes in the work, right? And then we've sandwiched between them 2 more traditional modes that by no means have work that is more traditional. So hopefully it gives everyone a good taste of the type of things they can expect in the collection. All right. This is the part where if I was teaching, I'd usually ask students to give me some type of affective response, telling me that they're with me, but I'm just going to have to hope you all are. So we're going to jump into participatory, right? So this is a section that thinks about how readers and audiences work together and participate in making the meaning very explicitly. And I think that these 3 pieces that we selected really challenge our ideas about single author enterprises, and they think instead more about relationships, interactions, co-presence, and shared meaning making. So we have Ander Monson, whose work on Tool Time, Arrow, Troll Time is a satire that becomes a sort of institutional critique, as a sort of Clippy-like figure moves from hallway installation to a collaborative student poetry project and asks who gets to speak inside institutions that don't listen. And for those of you that are older, like many of us are, Clippy was the original sort of help bot in Microsoft Word that would come in and tell you how to do things in Microsoft Word. Right? And then Anastacia-Renee, Don't Be Absurd, Alice in Parts was a performative installation. It was also documented in a video through the Fry Art Museum in Seattle. And it's thinking about the kind of living trans historical text that can shape embodiment, grief, and relations. And it's just really, really beautiful, evocative performance piece. Right. And then Danielle Vogel is A Nest Big Enough for Time, which thinks about multimodal practice as apprenticeship and collaboration with birds, nests, plants, and matter, and opens poetry to thinking more about ecological attention and transform the ways that we know things. Right. Sometimes we think about person to person in a human sense. What Danielle's work is doing is thinking about the human environmental relations that shape us. All right, so to our panelists, I'm going to launch us off for a brief discussion. And when we have 1 minute left, I'll hold a finger up so those watching the webinar know what's going on when I give weird hand signals before we move on to the next section. So our panelists know this, but they are welcome to diverge from the questions, to stick with one question, to just go on a different tangent, as long as everyone has a chance to talk. So the first one that I'm thinking about is asking how this type of participatory practice transforms poems into events or installations or habitats instead of stable objects, and then how it kind of shapes your writing practice. And I'm wondering if one of you would be willing to kind of jump in on that one. And if not, feel free to jump in on a different one I didn't ask yet.
I can jump in. Um, I think for me, when I'm writing poetry, I'm actually never thinking about it in a multimodal way. It is only when the work starts to feel too big, one dimensional, as if it's too big for a book or a page to hold the energy around the work, is usually when I decide I think this is something bigger. And not only am I in communication with the poem is then in communication energetically um, uh, with something bigger. It's like an energy happens when it's like too big to hold. And then I have to figure out ways that I can put it out into the world theoretically, so then the world can be in conversation with the poem and the poem's life and all that it covers.
I love that. I'm happy to build off of that. The essay that I wrote for the collection is centered around some of the books that I've written, in particular, Edges and Fray. Um, and I love this question about thinking of the poem as a habitat rather than a stable object. So there's like one really obvious way I can answer this question, and it's that at the beginning of Edges and Fray, there's an invitation to the reader that invites them to rove and meander and travel through the book in whichever order that they wish, and to like weave a nest of their own arrangement. And so in that way, I'm hoping to activate the book space as this kind of living ecology that shifts every single time you arrive at the book. The other side of that is that I'm a very slow, ceremonial, devotional um, poet, and I spent 10 years apprenticing myself to birds and watching how they build their birds' nests from where they live, from their circumstance, and that helped me really understand what it was that I was doing as a poet. Like I was shaping these architectures for habitation for my readers. And so they helped me understand all of these ways to um, weave my manuscripts in a way that could hold long enough, is how I came to understand it. Um, yeah. And so thinking of the poem as a habitat, book to book, each one has its own kind of organic, living logics that I'm always listening to. And that's how I structure, edit, unfold each project.
I like to think, I like that idea kind of like about bigness and about like connection. Um, the essay that I wrote is largely about my experience kind of poetically trolling my university that was in the process of trying to downsize our department and dismantle it in various ways. And so like when I got this 3D printed Clippy, like this sad little paper clip who everyone hated from the 90s, and I installed it in this art space that I curate. I really love the idea of like letting Clippy give voice to our concerns and our grief and our anger, and also making some jokes. Um, and as part of that, as that kind of project expanded, as like I got called into the dean's office to answer for my crimes, by like speaking the truth to power, the I just kind of like dug in further, and Clippy began to respond to these attempts to institutionally silence him. Um, and I kind of just got into this situation where it felt like it was big. The stakes were high. People were losing their jobs, people were being intimidated. And here, who was on that wall? It was Clippy, this anthropomorphized paperclip that everyone hated. But as I started to realize that not only could I sort of like write poems through Clippy, these kind of sad, tragic poems, but also trying to help, because that's his main thing. That's the only thing he does. He wants to help. Is like when I started to kind of chorally involve my undergraduates, who, you remember this was kind of during the second election that led to Trump, and they were, shall we say, pretty distressed at their, what their choices had kind of brought them. The like when I kind of allowed them to kind of talk through Clippy, to talk anonymously, to write these kind of collective collaborative poems through this kind of dumb joke of a speaker, it really allowed them to say some big stuff and to express some big concerns about the world in an anonymous and kind of collective way. And I really loved how that worked. And that feeling of like how a poem can be bigger than just, the object on the page, but really in conversation, like with a moment or with an ecology, as like you're talking about here, Danielle.
I think this actually, I'm grateful that you all touched in similar ways and it kind of built up because it goes perfectly to the next question. Right, that I wanted to ask about, which is really thinking about like institutions, environments, and non-human materials, right? Become collaborators. I'm thinking, Anastasia, about how I was in Seattle when your installation was part of it, right? And I was thinking about how there were like humans who are actually traversing the museum, but then there's also the kind of physical space. And I want to know more about how that like shaped the project, right? Or Danielle, like you said, you kind of apprenticed yourself to birds, right? Like wanting to know a little bit more about how they shaped where you saw things going or moments where you really felt that intervention. And I think Andrew a little bit too about like what it meant to be called to the sort of the dean's office, right? And how that shaped the project. So yeah, I think if I don't mind, I'm actually forced, if you don't mind starting first, Anastasia, and we can keep this order going.
Yeah, thank you for asking. The Fry exhibit, Don't Be Absurd, actually took place in Alice's house. So right away, I was like, I want to bring museum goers into a space that technically belongs to a character that they've been reading about. So the Fry exhibit was based around Alice's house, and her house was the last to be gentrified on the block. And I intentionally created a market, a new, cool, fresh market beside her house. So when museum goers came, they first saw the market, which looked nice, and then walked into her house. And the house was built of text and found um, objects. And so, in that way, I really wanted people to see normal items, but then read the poems associated. There's like eight white shirts. The character Alice, she knows what she likes. She likes a button-down white shirt. But I wanted the museum goers not to just say, "Oh, eight white shirts hanging on the wall." I wanted them to read the text associated with the white shirts. And so then in my mind, the white shirts then become a conversation that museum goers or listeners can have with the found objects. So I think in this way, the found objects became not only charged with this theoretic energy of Alice. It goes from, oh, some woman named Alice to this could be your neighbor's story, this could be your story, this could be your house. This could be your found object. This could be your shared grief. So I think starting out with the small, mundane, and letting it blow up as wide as it can to include um, not only conversations but epiphanies. I think it's really good to have epiphanies within a safe space. And for me, sort of like what you all were talking about, the objects and the environment of a space jumps from the poem to inhabit a space, and that space and that environment then jumps into the people. And lastly, I think I'm really interested in creating conversations. I'm not the kind of artist that wants you to come in and say, "Oh, that's really pretty." I hope that you leave with questions. I hope that you are chatting with other people, or I hope that you are going home um, to write about it. And I think that is a way that the environment and words can also be in conversation, whether we as the artists or writers know that it's happening or not.
I love all of that so much. I like don't even know which thread to pick up. I'm like, I wish we had 3 hours to just sit across the table from each other and talk. Um, I think one way to answer this is that for my whole poet life as a poet for like 20 plus years, I've been really devoted to what I've come to think of as like infusing English language grammars with elemental grammars, so earthen grammars. I've been listening to and with, I know I said I apprenticed myself to birds. I seriously did, but I feel that I've been apprenticed to all of the elements since I was a child. So what would it mean to flood English language grammars with dialects of water or air or deposits of clay or the way birds migrate or the way fires take over a landscape and heal them in some ways. And I've just been listening to these dialects and grammars and trying to see what happens if I help English, this what has become a very violent colonizing language, help it remember from where it came, and what would happen inside of the poem, what would happen inside of the reader's body if we flood the human body and the body of English, the English language, with these organic grammars. And so that has really, even when you can't tell, like some of my books, you would never know that was happening. That is what's happening under the surface of all of them. Each one has its own elemental force that I've been learning from and listening with, and it's helped me unfold the book. Even when I began to apprentice myself to birds, there was like a 3 or more year period where I was listening to what I was thinking of as these like wounded sites in the earthen landscape that were just stuffed full of clay, and thinking about the muscle of the earth, like this clay language, and learning a lot about how I sculpt with language. And that led me to the birds. And maybe like an even more obvious way to answer this is that or clear, maybe. I don't know. This all feels so diaphanous and huge, but is that I really, really wanted this book that I was writing, Edges and Fray, to be a series of, and I outlined this in the essay that I wrote for the collection, a series of micro essays that were sculpted in with the logics of specific birds' nests in mind. So like I had an essay that was a cup, a mound, a scratch stick pile, but they were all in sentences. And I had this book and I handed it into my editor, and she was like, no, 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 like this whole book wants to levitate. Like, are you really listening to the birds? And then I was like, oh, I haven't been paying attention in the ways that I needed to. And that kind of reframe really helped me understand that the book needed to be more ephemeral, fragmented, and I needed to invite the reader in as a weaver, a co-weaver of space, intelligence, and environment. Yeah, I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Danielle. Andrew,
Yeah,
I'm going to
that's
own that we have about a
fascinating.
minute left in our section.
Yeah, I'll just
We have about a minute left in our section. Okay, go ahead.
I'll just chime in briefly to say, yeah, I'm really interested in like the interactions both with the audience and with space. The space I was using is like it's like a 3x4x1 cabinet that normally gets used for, in departmental communications or faculty books, and has been like abandoned for years in my institution. And I kind of took it over as a kind of art space. I call it the smallest museum of art at the University of Arizona. And I'm interested in the way in which like art can emerge from non-art spaces. And like Anastacia was talking about, the idea of like being in communication with the people that come by and might be like delighted or have questions or wonder like what these spaces are and like what exactly we're doing here. And I feel like that back and forth is a kind of collaboration that's implied in the poem, but when the poem exists in a physical space, I think it can be made more explicit and more powerful, almost a little bit like a video game, like in certain ways. You have to interact with the thing to really get the experience of the thing and then to see what can emerge from it. And very delightful to think about these things. So I appreciate all these thoughts.
That was wonderful. I'm glad you stuck in what you wanted to say because I really loved your contribution. Thank you. We're going to move to the next section. I know this is almost awkward and how quickly we're trying to move. We're having technical difficulties with people joining on Zoom. So if people are on the YouTube, as a heads up, I'm texting with Case and we're trying to figure out what happens that people can't join the Zoom, but this will be recorded and it will live on YouTube. So we might end up having to just kind of share after the fact. But just as a heads up, if you're getting texts from friends, we know what's going on and we're trying to figure it out. But I'll move to the next part. Um, and again, thank you so much to the three of you because that was already an exciting discussion. So the next section is moderated by Basil. So Basil, I'm going to mute and turn my camera off and it's all you.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to think a little bit about visuals in poetry. So this section explores the intersections of visual art and poetry through collage, bokeh, painting, comics, handwriting, and video. These works ask how spatial arrangements, color, texture, and visual processes generate meanings that words alone cannot reach. So what can we do to supplement our words with visuals, or vice versa? So we're going to hear from three wonderful people. We have Naoko Fujimoto, whose work in line break, hyper-awareness, and text collage brings Japanese waka into conversation with graphic and spatial poetics, using visual translation as both artistic method and pedagogy. And then we'll hear from Scott Poole, whose poetry and painting take classes at Arthur Murray, uses poem painting pairs to let each medium destabilize and reimagine the other, opening humor, myth, and subconscious revelation. And then we're going to hear from Mita Mahato in Alligator Gut, plastics collage and text produce an eco-poetic elegy and critique shaped by consumption, waste, and interspecies language. Can you change the slide, CR? Thank you. Okay, so we're going to hear from our three wonderful poets about their work. So, my friends, what is at stake for you in creating work that complicates the distinction between text and image? Why do you have to do it? Or why are you compelled to do work that includes the two?
Hi, I'll go first. Thank you so much for having me today. So I want to be aware of how to better communicate with my readers. So I have two visual books. One is Griff, and the other is Of Woman, is forthcoming this June. So when I created Griff, some editors said the author usually reaches readers, but Griff needs to be reached. So positively, my book needs to be actively read, but it also means it was hard to read. So for my new translation book, Of Women, I wanted to create a more reader-friendly book. Also, I wrote about it in the textbook. Especially, I am introducing Japanese traditional waka poems.
I'll go. For me, what's at stake is trying to discover the magic back in the everyday world again. And as poets, as painters, we run into the problem of, okay, I did a painting of a tree and a landscape, and so what? So I've been using my poetry sensibilities to inform my painting and how can you, using some of the techniques I learned as a poet first, to start to dig out meaning from a normal everyday scene. And so the use of writing a little bit about it and then going back to the painting and then going back and forth opened up both mediums for me in incredible ways that I think there was doors there that helped both open and see new insights into the everyday, and hopefully some magic was transmitted of that collaboration. And for me, that's what's really exciting about bringing the two things together. Just so you know, this is kind of what I do. I put a book with a poem next to it. I do a painting and a poem next to it. And so.
First of all, yeah, this discussion is already so rich and so just grateful to be part of it. I think that, I'll echo everything that Naoko and Scott said, but then add something to that, which is just the complications that arise. I think that the way that the question is phrased complicates the distinction between text and image, is something that I kind of relish in when I'm making my work. With Alligator Gut, the subtitle for this poem is a representation of survival with papers, polyethylene, and residual inks. And the ask that was given to me was to make a poetry comic about survival. And my twisted brain didn't go to the conventional, but went to thinking about plastics, this kind of material that will survive us all. And so I wanted to kind of think about, and what I like to think about in my work is with poetry, we are, the work of poetry is to wonder about how words mean and the meanings that we ascribe to words and how we can play with that. And I want to bring that same sensibility to image and to materials. So by putting them together to kind of draw out these questions about how we make meaning and how we're used to kind of looking at the ways that things mean and how to kind of see to the side of that.
Wow, all of your stuff already leads into this question, but let's think a little bit more about, or we'll hear a little bit more. All of you have been saying great things already, but what do visual methods make possible for your processes that text-centered poetry may not? So where does text fail? Where do you supplement it with the visual?
It is hard to explain, so let me use an example. So like a French menu cuisine for a curated or course meal has a traditional steps, right? Such as appetizer, followed by soup and the main dish, etc. But the soup and the main dish will never coexist in your mouth because they are brought in a certain order. However, the traditional Japanese meal is very different. The appetizer, food, and the main dish coexist on a big tray. So there is a rule for eating rice and the soup, but overall, we mix the flavor in our mouth. So the approach to eating varies by culture. So that text-centered poetry is usually read from top to bottom, but this rule may not apply to visual poems, as we all know. So if the author successfully negotiate the rule, any format is possible. That I believe, and then I try to working on.
I love that, the mixing of all the meal together in one spot. That's a great idea. That kind of explains a little bit about what I'm trying to do with I don't want to illustrate my poems. That's I've been like, I don't want to do that. I basically want to start in on the painting, let its colors and shapes and images mix together in that meal, and then see what that energy is that's coming out, and then drive the poem off of that energy. And I think it's in turn the poetic urge to make more of something and dig out the emotion and the meaning in it is that drives the painting forward to be more than it could be as just one part of a meal. So, like the poem and the painting are separate, but they could be together on this table and you could eat them at the same time. So I like that.
Yeah, the kind of articulation of how working in this way is kind of, we don't have to work with the formats that have been given to us. And that really resonates for me. For me, when I am working with just words, whether it's just writing an email or an essay or attempting to write a word poem, I get very stuck. And it's as if, and again, this is just for me, but it's as if there's some kind of core meaning that I'm trying to get out of the words. and I'm just waiting for the words to kind of like fit in together in this very rigid way to capture whatever it is I'm trying to say. But then when I bring in the collage elements, the visual elements, that just gets busted open. And what ends up happening is that I'm looking for surprise, or I get surprised. You know, it's like, what if I put this paper with this image? What if I weave it in this way? And there's kind of like a, you know, like I see things that I hadn't seen before. And it opens me up. It reminds me of what Anastasia was saying about having epiphanies, that my experience of my work can be about having epiphanies, and then I can translate that or offer that to readers as well. So yeah, it very much is about kind of like working in this way becomes about being open to surprise and not being constrained by rigidity.
That's incredible. Thank you all. So you're all going into process already of how you make your poetry, how it looks different for each poem, because none of us have the same process when we create a beautiful mess of multimodal visual poetry. So let's move into our next question of how does process become visible as part of your visual poetry's meaning, even maybe in the works that we have here for you all, or from you all?
I can try to start. um, yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I really want the page to be available to the reader in a way that is kind of not fixed, where it is as open to me for interruption and cutting into as it is for the reader. Alligator Gut is kind of like a blend of found poetry and erasure and blackout. And so the idea there is that the text alone it does not contain kind of some kind of knowledge that we can kind of uphold and and see as kind of fixed, but that there are voices that are always kind of interacting with it. And it's a way to echo kind of like how we operate in the world and the ecosystems and different systems that we're in conversation with. It reminds me of what Danielle was saying about the poem being a habitat, and how kind of like making that process visible on the page. Like when I'm cutting out, it's like, oh wait, what if I leave this strand here and just curve it over there? For the reader to be able to kind of think about how that's working as they're reading, that there was a before and there will be an after to the page, just as we are kind of moving and operating through our different ecosystems and places.
One thing I noticed when I started painting, because I was a poet first for 20 years, and then in midlife I became a painter. And as I started painting, I would just do really unpoetic images. They were very just, I want to draw a tree, I want to draw a cow. They're just kind of it was just getting going, and then I felt like my painting started to change, and I was like, well, why is this changing? And I realized that what I've been using, the techniques I've been using for poetry all these years, were changing the paintings. Instead of like in the book, I have of violins on fire in a boat, and I started with that image, and I'm like, well, should I just put the fire pit of the violins on fire? Should I just paint that? No, let's put it in a boat in a lake with two people holding it from two ends, with, and that those pieces built up, that process built up through layers of painting and drawing, um, through the process. And what I realized is I was driving it forward with a poetic sensibility of, you know, taking a central tension in a poem and building up stanzas around it, to create a through line. And so, um, I think the process comes out that there's a lot of dynamics happening in the painting.
Ooh, and it seems like we have 1 moment left. Naoko, would you like to be our final thoughts for this section?
I think you're having audio issues. No, we can't hear you. We'll hopefully try to loop back around later. I'm helping you out, Basil. Sorry. We want to move on to sound, but I wanted to thank Basil for doing an awesome job moderating, and thank the three of you. I'm glad, Naoko, that your sound at least worked at the beginning, so we heard some of your awesome input. I'm going to
Thank
skip
you.
to the next slide and pass it along to Ben. But thank you all three. And thank you, Basil. That's hard to do.
Thanks, everyone. Our next three panelists do a lot of work with sound. So they write traditional poems, but they also integrate different kinds of sound work into their poetry. We have a really wonderful mix. We have folks who are working. Abe Smith works with Americana type music. He has a band, the Snarling Yarns, has worked as both a spoken word poet and also combines live music with improvisational poetry, in addition to writing traditional work. Patrick Milian's A Prime Number of Lines for Nadia and Lil Bollinger combines poetry with a musical score by Emerson Eads, and the performance explores queer and disability histories through collaboration with different musicians and performers. So it also takes a kind of historical dive into early queer poets. Michael Sowder's work focuses on devotional poetry and devotional music, so bringing together both music, poetry, and visuals as well. So we'll jump right into this conversation. We'll move on to the questions, CR. Great. So thinking through your own work, your essay and other projects that you've done, think about your relationship both with collaborators and the kinds of sounds that you like to integrate into your own work.
I'm happy to start if that's all right and
That'd be great.
talk about my incredible collaborators. So I've had the pleasure of working with a composer named Emerson Eads. He's based out of North Dakota these days. And we've worked on music together, and I think of as sort of like my primary collaborator in all of this, in a pretty typical sort of like librettist composer relationship where I compose a written text and send it to him, and then we kind of negotiate. And he says, this word sounds pretty bad when you sing it, and I'll say, okay, well this melody sounds pretty bad in this moment. We sort of have some back and forth, and we have a working relationship that way. But there's so many other collaborators involved in a piece like this. So they're the singers on the recording of this piece of music, Arwen, Hannah, and Susan. But then we have, I suppose, the space in which the recording was made, and that's a kind of collaborator as well. And we might have other singers performing it a different night in a different space with a different audience. And every single one of these individuals or groups sort of brings something to this piece that has no single state. It has no single form. It's in this like continual state of flux. And I'm interested in sort of how collaboration and multimodality has this, it plays this weird trick on you where it seems to be aspiring toward this like totality, but in fact is just like falling further and further apart as these different collaborators expose like the shortcomings of one another's mediums, building on and dismantling one another's work. So yeah, that's sort of my relationship with my collaborators, both the main ones and the ones I sort of think about maybe after the fact.
Thanks.
I can jump in next. Just want to say thanks to Ben and CR for this project, and Case and Lisa for helping to make this. happen. So my work with my collaborators is we're designing a website, and I really need to give a little background for my project because it's kind of multi-layered. So I have an Indian guru, and her name is Indira Devi. She was a poet and a mystic. She's no longer in her body, but when she was alive, she frequently went into this yogic, ecstatic state called samadhi. And in these states, she would experience these visions of a 16th century poet and mystic named Mirabai. And in these visions, Mirabai would sing these bhajans, they're called, which are like poems or devotional songs to Indira, my guru. And then when Indira came out of samadhi, she would sing the bhajans to her own guru, who was a classically trained musician, and he would write down both the words and the music. So over the course of her life, Indira received over 900 of these bhajans in these visions, and they just came fully formed out of her mouth when she would come out of the trance. And interestingly, her first language was Urdu, her second language was English, but these bhajans were in Hindi, a language that she just had a working knowledge of. Hindi was the language of the 16th century Saint Mirabai. And so really striking that these would just come out of her mouth fully formed. So two devotees of hers, a Sanskrit scholar and a Hindi scholar, invited me to collaborate on English translations of these bhajans. So far, we've translated about 112 of them. We've created a website, and the website features the original bhajans in Hindi, both in text and with audio versions sung by a classically trained Indian vocalist. The website has our English translations, both in text and in spoken audio versions. Each bhajan is also accompanied by an original work of visual art, a painting or an illustration. So the website is a work in progress, and we still have a long way to go. And I guess kind of like addressing the second question a little bit, that, I mean, I feel like the significance of the project is that ecstatic religious experience is kind of by definition considered to be outside of language. And so our project highlights the different attempts at representation of such experience through media, different languages, through written poetry, audio song, as well as through visual art. So that's what we've been up to. Thanks.
Thanks, y'all. Yeah, collaboratively on the page, I'm probably reading Will Alexander right before I write, so the patina of his phrasings are there. There's a marvelous sound poet named Steve Timm, Timm, based out of Madison, Wisconsin. We've had a co-conspiratorial friendship for about a quarter century now. I'm always writing towards him what will make him yap and jump and sing. And I'm always thinking of the idioms of rural vernacular of the top of Wisconsin, where I was raised and returned to often. I have a new book come out today called Surgencies. That's a collaboration in the sense that although Leopold meant it, ecosystem being a family of things. And so that's a kind of magpieing together of spring peeper, frog, ventriloquism, prism, if you will, and barn swallows, watching the way they scissor the sky, thinking of the soul's fabric, and seeing how, the sound tears and coheres. With the band The Snarlin' Yarns, we've got 3 records out now. Our last one came out in January. I improvise live, and I improvise in the studio. Right before we do the take in the studio, I write down quickly a couple of words. This can come from around the room, a bent paperclip, something that Mara Brown or William Paulette or Ryan Ridge or Tommy Dolph said just moments ago. And again, I'm trying to, with a kind of integrity, but a certain kind of intuitive, illogical velocity, stitch together the present moment. When it's going badly, I'm trying to remember what I'm hoping to say, and when it's going well, I just kind of fall down through the trapdoors of images and live in the happiness of meander.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, guys. When you think about your use of sound, along with written and spoken language. Do you find that it does something to the poetry? Obviously, you were inspired to integrate sound into your poetics. Can you talk a little bit about why that was important to you?
That's a
Oh, go ahead, Patrick. Go ahead.
All right. I'll go ahead, but I'll be quick. I'm afraid I don't have a terribly intellectual answer. But when my first attempt at being an artist was to be a musician. And I studied classical trombone and took it pretty far, and then didn't really work out. Not a bright future for a lot of classical trombonists out there. And so I sort of changed lanes and ended up writing poetry. And I feel like ever since then, I've just been trying to get back to music kind of through the side door. And I feel like I have such tremendous respect for musicianship and the meaning making that music is capable of. And I'm so interested in kind of like accessing that form of meaning making through linguistic channels. And I think that's a fool's errand. You're never going to fully access that. But I think that's what's always drawn me to collaboration and multimodality is just like ultimately trying to find that back door into those capacities that music has.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say something that in the greater world of yoga, there are practices that work on all different aspects of our human being, and music is really central to the practice of bhakti yoga, which is like the yoga of love and devotion. And so, music, my first English professor, he used to bring his violin to class and play Bach for us, and he said that music speaks directly to the soul, and music kind of bypasses the conceptual mind, which you're trying to get below when you're like practicing meditation anyway. And so I find it super powerful when words are put to music because we have both a conceptual thing going on, and then we also have this deep, deep kind of non-conceptual communication. So, yeah.
Yeah, I came to poetry through folk music, Leadbelly, Woody Guthrie, and the list goes on. I also love to work on my playful work while listening to guitarists such as Eva Mendoza, Marisa Anderson, and especially Charlie Parr. When I'm revising my poetry, I'm trying to just push more music into it until it doesn't mirror a road straightness so much as a kind of a deer trail through the woods. And the greatest godsend in the collaborative snarling yarns improvisation is silence, because it just goes ahead and putties over the misstep of my last phrase and gives me, the great good of the next moment to not necessarily mend or amend, but to, yeah, get at the next little cup of fresh water.
Great. Thank you guys. I think we'll move to our next section. I appreciate all of you guys. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben, for guiding that. And thanks to the three of you. That was a really fun conversation. I have updates for everyone that's basically just here, which is the wrong Zoom URL was attached to the calendar invite. So Keith and I have been chatting. And we might run a few minutes over. So if you have to run, that's totally okay. But it'll be recorded and up later. So we'll hopefully be able to hear and see everything down the road. All right, Maya, you want to take it away?
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Maya. Could we go to the next slide? Sorry. Maybe. Perfect, thank you. All right, so I'm going to be discussing access, and this section treats access not as an afterthought, but as a central poetic and conceptual force that contributes for foreground how poems are entered through different bodies, senses, institutions, finances, materials, and cognitive pathways. So we have four artists for this section. So we have DJ Savarese, who has Beneath and Beyond Words. And they present multimodal composition as a form of neurodivergent access, resisting neurotypical and logocentric constraints through sound, gesture, ekphrasis, and nonlinear cognition. We also have Jennifer Colville in this section. And Prompt Press proposes ekphrasis as an open, joyful, iterative process, moving among visual art, written response, and handmade books. We also have Lisa Bickmore in this section with Bend, Scatter, Shift, Deflect, where they theorize multimodal reading as wayfinding, inviting readers to wander associatively rather than lock into fixed interpretation. And then we have Kelly Hoffer as our last one with cyanotypes, thread, and botanical fragments, turning revision into transformation rather than correction, showing how material process reshapes poetic thinking. So we can move on to the discussion questions now. Potentially. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So, DJ, Jennifer, Lisa, and Kelly, we're going to start with our first question, which is what kinds of materials or systems, institutional, digital, personal, shape the trajectory of a piece beyond the artist's control? So, if anyone wants to pop in on this.
I can say something. Hi, thanks so much for having us. This is really wonderful to be taking part. Um, a lot of my work thinking very specifically about material constraint and responding to material constraint in the way that we might think of um, a, a, a poet who works in form, responding to something like traditional form, right? So if you have a poet who finds it very generative to be thinking in iambic pentameter, and that particular form is sort of making possibilities or generating options, right? I think of my work as doing something similar, but rather than using a sort of received poetic form, thinking about the material constraints that might inspire and provide a kind of architecture to work through with your imagination. A lot of my work has been using the space of the page as one of those material constraints. And also I make cyanotypes, which are basically solar prints, right? So thinking about how I have to respond to weather, right? How I respond to the sun or a cloud cover in order to make something, and often very quickly. So that's been really exciting for me to think about how the world around me might be helping me or hindering me, and therefore helping me get out of my own way, I suppose, as a poet. I really believe that my best poems happen when I'm not in total control. And I'll stop there for right now. Thanks so much.
I'll jump in. I just wanted to say that so Light Scatter Press, which is the sort of focus of my work for the purposes of this project, as a publisher and then a facilitator of collaboration between the verbal artist and the designer and a coder usually, and sometimes another artist who's doing work related to and in response to the book. So in some sense, a kind of ekphrasis, although the mediums of the ekphrasis shift. I feel like there's a certain nimbleness that's required, and I'm not fully claiming nimbleness for myself. But I will say that I have to bring it up and drum it up to be able to do this work. We're always working with the constraints of a particular medium. The goal of Light Scatter Press is to try and expand and multiply the spaces where readers can encounter the work the poetry. And but that means coming up against the constraints. So for instance, what our website can handle, what a coder can do, despite whatever I imagine a coder can do, the deliverable of a particular artist responding to the work, and the sort of space that opens. So there is always a sort of horizon of discovery and surprise in the work. And I like that about doing this publishing work. And it's also always challenging.
I can jump in.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, part of the excitement of Prompt Press, which is essentially an acrostic press, although it's visual art, writers responding to that, and then book artists responding, or it's writers and visual artists responding to that, and then the book artist. The book artist always has the last word. So the excitement of that was developing something outside of an academic system, and so kind of looking back and seeing the constraints that the academy has built into it. Like there's the obvious siloing, but even in the workshop, we sort of privilege like complete works. You have to have your work polished to the greatest extent that you can get it to, um and then what happens is a critique of it, and not so much I'm curious what would happen if somebody did like a response. What if somebody did in a workshop like a visual art response, or you did their own poetic response to what you had written? So I just that kind of that sort of back and forth is something that I realized once I was out the safety net. The academy has wonderful things to offer, but once I was outside of the safety net, there's a different way of thinking about making art.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I think all of your insights are such a beautiful discussion we're having that I'm getting excited and wanting to write poetry now. So let's move on to our second question. In what ways can collaboration between poets, artists, coders, and readers expand the meaning and reach of a poem? And I think, DJ, you were going to respond to this one first.
For me, poetry is a rhythmless, neurocosmopolitan meeting ground, expansive, dynamic, sensuous, a space with multiple entry points. As we collaborate with other poets and artists and dislodge our readers from the page, we both push the boundaries of poetry and make a once individualistic experience communal improvisation. This can happen quite literally, as it did in my co-authored chapbook, Studies in Brotherly Love, in which 4 poets, not one, dialogue with the artwork of Malcolm Corley, introducing our readers to each other's work, allowing an embrace of Black vernacular, a respect for nature, and a yearning for a non-speech-centric world to commingle, and offering an ever-expansive understanding of Corley's paintings. Or it can happen more organically. In my documentary film To Each, inclusion shouldn't be a lottery. M. Cooper and I create a kind of neurocosmopolitan dialect or diet of poetry and oil paint animation, one in which poetry is asked to paint, and painting is asked to play the drums, to keep rhythmic time. Visceral and sensorial, these cross-genre entanglements leave viewers temporarily untethered. They can't understand what is happening with words. Together, the 2 art forms suck us all into a space at once exhilarating and disorienting, where motion, rhythm, pattern, color, sound, and texture freely converse. That space leads us not to a singular conclusion, but out into a field of endlessly unfolding possibility.
Does anyone want to add to that? I mean, that was such a beautiful response, DJ. Like the combination of sound, texture, and creating a space where these things happen in the mind and also in different formats. Beautiful. Anyone want to add?
I guess
I
I would
just want
just
to
say,
say,
oh, go ahead,
okay.
Lisa.
I just
Lisa,
wanted to say just one thing for the reader. I feel like the question of who is the reader of poetry is always a vexed one. And I think I remember hearing Joy L. McSweeney, whose work I admire very much, say she never thinks about the reader when she writes. And I thought, so I've kept that in my own mind about the reader's role. And I just think that imagining the reader encountering the work in multiple spaces and entering it in multiple ways is one of the most interesting things about the role that I play in creating books and other spaces.
I guess I was just gonna say something about how we never, every poem is a collaboration because language is bigger than the singular speaker or singular writer, right? We're always in this kind of social relation whenever we're using language, and that's part of the magic of it, right? Like that's where some of the mystery lies, but also where it gets away from us in a way that I find really generative and exciting. And so I just want to point out that even as we're trying to sort of amplify collaboration through these explicit means, the writing a poem is always this sort of collaborative process, right? And we're maybe just making that aspect of it more explicit and turning the volume up on that particular mode, right? Or that particular aspect of the work.
Yeah, I'd love to echo that. I think that all writing is hybrid. It all carries the residues of what the writer has read and all sorts of other art that the writer has absorbed. And um, yeah, and I like what Kelly said, that we're kind of amplifying that. And I think that's a part of the mission of Prompt Press, is to sort of turn a spotlight on the process. So, we have a body of visual art up by a um, visual artist, and we have an open call for writers in any form to respond. But then when we get those side by side up, and they come in on kind of on a rolling basis, we see the different, we get maybe a peek into that particular artist's mind. We see what was it from this art that they absorbed, and then that came back out in whatever they're preoccupied with. And then our writers, often we try to get them to write process statements, and also so we have that other little piece of evidence. So we have a kind of like a lab of process of creative inspiration.
Okay. I was going to say, I think we might just be out of time, CR. Is that correct?
It is.
Okay.
So good to know you can tackle 2 questions in 15 minutes in groups of 3. So moving forward. But Maya, that was wonderful. DJ, thank you for preparing those comments. That was really beautiful insights. And the 4 of you managing to talk about so much in such a compressed time was really inspiring. So thank you. I'm going to have a couple closing comments and then kind of give us a little more internally facing some comments for us about how to share our discussion today, given the mix up with the Zoom webinar link. Right. But first of all, just thank you again to everyone for showing up on a Tuesday morning and contributing so much. I really appreciate it. If you don't mind turning cameras on for the last screen, because sometimes that's nice when I can stop sharing, we can see everyone's faces. If you can't turn your camera on for access reasons, that's of course okay. And Ben, I know you've been having to try to teach at the same time. So I just appreciate all of you. Want to call out, of course, that this is part of a book that everybody here is in, and it should be out in 2027. We originally titled it Mixtures and Margins. I decided to call it that for today too, but it'll be a writer's guide to multimodal poetry. And it will have some of the essays from everyone's artwork today, as well as discussion questions for classrooms. I was trying to figure out how to email everybody when that comes out, and I was like, I'll just use my own newsletter because I don't know if our college or someone else will announce it. So you do not have to sign up for my newsletter, but if you want to get a notification, delete every other email until that comes through. That is one way to get it in your inbox when the book is out. And then I wanted to plug the rest of the Utah Poetry Festival. I am betting that it will have the correct Zoom link for every single event moving forward in April after today. So I created a bit.ly in case any of you want to type it in separately or you're accessing these slides later, because Lisa's put together a really extraordinary program of just different events across Utah. And a lot of them are on Zoom, which I think is pretty fantastic for those that are not in Utah, but still want to see what's happening in the Mountain West with poetry. And that's an extraordinary lift. So I just want to thank everybody again. And then we'll kind of abruptly sign off, and you're going to get a lot more emails from me about how to access this later and share it with people. But thank you for being so gracious and bringing all of your insights today. And especially to Basil and Maya, because it was their first time moderating a giant panel. Y'all did awesome. So yeah, really appreciate you all, and hopefully I'll see y'all soon. Oh, and selfishly, if you're going to the New Orleans Poetry Festival and want to say hi, shoot me a text or email, because it'd be nice to see some friendly faces this weekend. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.